Click here if you are having trouble viewing video on a mobile device. Pinecrest. The answer to the problem of California's catastrophic megafires can be found in the ashes of this forest, where clusters of fragrant sugar pines stand strong, elegant and healthy. Bark is charred. Logs are charcoal. But a strategy of selective logging, followed by a manually prescribed burn, has created a forest as clean and safe as a cathedral. Fire will always be part of California. The question is, are we going to burn on our terms, said ecologist Eric Knapp, on a hike through his research project in this natural laboratory at Stanislaus Tuolumne Experimental Forest, a 1,700-acre U.S. Forest Service area in the central Sierra Nevada. The alternative, say scientists, is a continued sequence of fires that start during the most extreme weather conditions, ignite dense fuel, then spread ferociously out of control. As the Delta Fire races through a swath of Shasta Trinity National Forest and private timberland, forcing the weekend closure of a nearly 50-mile stretch of Interstate 5 north of Redding. California's link to Oregon, policymakers will look to such research to guide the state's proposed new commitment of $1 billion to reduce the risk of mega wildfires across the state. The legislation, if signed by Gov. Jerry Brown, commits $165 million a year for 5 years to thin forests and $35 million a year for 5 years to fund prescribed burning projects. The majority of the forests now burning in the fast-moving Delta Fire haven't seen fire since the early 1900s, when records were first kept, according to Knapp. A similar fate could await other woodlands. We're far behind in forest management, according to John Laird, California's Secretary for Natural Resources. About 500,000 acres of forest each year need to be treated in California. Last year, we treated only half that. A walk through almost any woods in California reveals the immensity of the problem. Many forests of the Sierra Nevada are 2 to 3 times denser than they were historically, when small and frequent fires were routine, say scientists. Crowded trees struggle to compete for water, especially during the 2 severe and sustained droughts of 1987 to 1992 and 2012 to 2017. Stress weakened their natural defenses. Populations of predatory bark beetles surged. Forest floors are carpeted with debris. About 129 million trees now stand ready to ignite. It's a mess of a forest, said Knapp of the U.S. Forest Service, as he hiked through thick branches of sugar pine, dubbed the king of the conifers by naturalist John Muir, on an unthinned and unburned parcel of the experimental plots. The research forest was established in 1943 to study how different management techniques affect a landscape. U.S. Forest Service research ecologist Eric Knapp looks at dead tree branches that would be considered ladder fuel in an unthinned and unburned starting conditions section of the Stanislaus Tuolumne Experimental Forest in Pinecrest, California. Poaching, Bay Area News Group. Meanwhile, over the past century we've been snuffing out every spark. This absolutist attitude to wildfires initially made sense. America was stunned by the Great Fire of 1910 in Idaho and Montana, which killed 87 people and burned 3 million acres, including several entire towns. In its aftermath, the U.S. Forest Service promoted 10 a.m. policy, with the goal of suppressing all fires by 10 a.m. of the day following their report. Fuels have been accumulating for decades now, without any intervention, said Jim Branham of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. About 98% of all wildfires are suppressed before they reach 300 acres in size. What happens to the other 2% of fires? They escape containment and explode into megafires in fuel-loaded forests, under often extreme weather conditions, such as heat and high winds. The consequences of megafires are far more catastrophic than historic burns. Firefighters perish. Entire stands of trees are incinerated. Heat sterilizes the forest floor, and nearby communities are put at risk. The problem has come back to bite us in the butt, said plant ecologist Malcolm North of UC Davis, who studies the role of fire in the Teakettle experimental forest, near Fresno. This year's sequence of megafires has been so severe that CAL FIRE says it's running out of money and needs another $234 million to get through the season. The state will likely dip into budget reserves for the 8th time in 10 years to cover the cost of suppression. Our fecund forests grow more flammable every day. The state's climate change assessment report, released last month, predicts that the acreage consumed by wildfires in an average year will soar 77% by the end of the century. That's about 500,000 acres of additional wildfires each year, the equivalent of 2 car fires. NAP's experimental plots use 2 different approaches to logging, conducted in 2011. In some, trees were removed uniformly. They stand like a regiment of soldiers, well-spaced and similar in age. In others, they were removed in groups, leaving clusters of trees ranging in age and size to remain. But logging alone isn't enough because it's not thorough enough, say scientists. We can't thin our way out of this problem, said North. Crews ignite a prescribed burn in California's Stanislaus Tuolumne experimental forest, in the Central Sierra. Photo courtesy of Eric Knapp, U.S. Forest Service. Following logging, prescribed burns were set to Knapp's plots in 2013. Because forests are logged, with trees removed, the fire is less intense and easier to control, he said. Burning is a carefully choreographed dance, involving teams of 50 or 60 people, as well as fire engines and hoses. The day starts at dawn, with a meteorologist watching weather, wind and humidity. Each site has a secured perimeter, cleared of debris. Wielding a drip torch, which drops a gas-diesel mix, crews ignite spots or stripes of the forest. Because flames want to run uphill, they do the reverse, called backburning, starting high and then dropping down a ridge. The fire ends at each strip of black char. Any rogue flames are quickly doused with water. It's slow and tedious work. The size of each burn is limited by how much can be done in one day. The average fire average is only 90 to 100 acres in size. Afterwards, crews stay to monitor and mop up. In the months and years that follow logging and fires, Knapp's team tracks the forest changes, studying plant growth and wildlife. The clustered approach to thinning sugar pine seems the best, slowing future fires. It breaks up the stand, creating fuel discontinuity into the future, he said. Striding through a meadow of ceanothus and manzanita shrubs, he pointed out the diversity in the new vegetation, creating food for wildlife and room for species like oak, white fern cedar. A 185-foot-tall sugar pine, its canopy green and glorious, reached for the sky. Below it, tiny pine seedlings poked through the duff. Bumblebees hovered around thistle blossoms. A garter snake slithered into a hole. To be sure, prescribed burns are controversial. In 2000, a burn escaped control and destroyed 200 buildings, leaving people homeless. And they create smoke, causing breathing problems. Logging is also controversial. The Sierra Club, California urges the state to instead tighten building codes, better enforce rules requiring defensible space and limit development in high-risk areas. But we really only have 2 options, said North. We can continue with what we're doing, kicking the can down the road, he said. Or we can be proactive, putting the instrument of fire back on the landscape. U.S. Forest Service research ecologist Eric Knapp walks through a meadow created by a variably thinned, then burned, forest section of the Stanislaus Tuolumne experimental forest in Pinecrest, California. Clearing is an open gap in the section that emphasizes gaps, group structure and variable age in the forest. Lipo Chang, Bay Area News Group.